We will now hear evidence from the National Association of Prison Officers and the Prison Officers Association, who I invite to step forward. Sorry. Point of order.
I'm not throwing things here, but I know Mr. Wallace asked questions about IPPs which are not currently in the bill, and I'm wondering whether, given the constraint we have on time here, as you've just seen, whether it's permissible to ask about things which aren't in the bill.
Yes, when responding to that point of order, which the Honourable Member makes a extremely valid point, there was another question from a member on his own side of the chamber, which was also slightly wide of the mark, but I used my chairman's discretion to allow both to take place. But his advice to the chair is well meant and well put, and if we can keep to the terms of the bill, that would maximise the effectiveness of the time deployed. Mr. Wallace, point of order.
Following on from Mr. Slaughter's point, the question that I raised in IPP, first of all, which is the sentencing bill, and I appreciate your discretion in using it. But secondly, the submission from the witnesses that gave evidence this morning did include IPPs when they had made submissions both to the Green Paper and indeed in public. So I thought it was correct that this was a final opportunity to ask them their view of an IPP. As we have said, and the government has openly said, measures on IPP hopefully may be coming forward at some stage through the course of the bill.
Well, I'd like to thank Mr. Wallace for that point of order, and his remarks are on the record. We'll now hear evidence from the National Association of Probation Officers, apologies for my mispronunciation earlier, and the Prison Officers Association. For the record, please would you be kind enough to introduce yourselves to the committee, and if either or both of you would like to make a short statement to the committee, you're invited to do so.
I'm Steve Gillen, General Secretary of the Prison Officers Association.
My name is Jonathan Ledger. I'm General Secretary of NAPO.
Thank you. Can I have indications of members who'd like to speak? At the moment I have Helen Goodman, Andy Slaughter, Dave Watts, Yvonne Favard, Elfyn Llwyd, Alex Cunningham and Mike Crockhart. Given going from opposition to government, I'll take Mike Crockhart second, then the running order as I've described. This session ends at 12 o'clock. Helen Goodman.
Thank you very much. One of the government's main objectives is to increase very significantly the number of prisoners who work while they're in prison. At the moment, a minority of prisoners are working for around 20 hours a week, and the government's proposal is to get almost all prisoners working 40 hours a week. I think it would be really helpful to the committee if we could understand what the implications of this are in terms of running the prisons, particularly from Mr. Gillam, what sort of staff oversight this would entail, what sort of other investment might be needed, and something about the practicalities of this.
Well, firstly, I would say...
Steve Gillam.
Yes. Firstly, I would say that we broadly support the ethos of prisoners working and indeed being trained for when they're released so that they can hold down proper jobs and as part of the rehabilitation process. However, I think when Kenneth Clarke announced it to the Conservative Party conference last year, we were taken by surprise when he announced that a 40-hour week, bearing in mind that the core day had been cut previous to that.
The core day, could you just explain to the committee what the core day is?
The core day is in relation to how long prisoners are out during a day. And at the weekend, a few years ago, that core day was slashed simply because there wasn't enough money to go around. Now, the Prison Officers Association said we weren't in favour of that because in actual fact it locked prisoners up for longer. However, we say we're broadly in support of prisoners coming out to work. We don't think that they can get anywhere near 40 hours a week because one, there's not the space, and two, there isn't the resources with the ongoing cuts over the next 4 or 5 years.
What sort of what sort of impact would it have on staff if 40 hours was achieved? I mean, would it mean employing more people? Would it mean longer hours? Could you explain in a little bit more detail?
I think there's different ways of looking at it, and you've got to look at the detail. And at the moment, there is no detail, and that's our problem. For example, prison officers work on average 39 hours a week, so it's ridiculous to consider that prisoners should be working for 40 hours a week when the staff just aren't going to be there to implement that. That is one of the resource implications that we would have. And of course, prison officer numbers are actually going to fall as prisons are closed, and indeed with further market testing on the horizon.
And could you say something about what the change in the prisoners' core day has been, for example, over the last 10 years?
Well, I think it actually shows and demonstrates in the parliamentary answers to some questions about the activity of work that prisoners have. And I think on average, if I remember correctly, it's about 13.9 hours at 2009/2010. I was recently in Home House last week, and they've managed to get 100 prisoners working up to 34 hours a week, but that's keeping prisoners out over lunchtime. But the real worry is from the Governor that once the budget cuts start to kick in over the next 3 or 4 years, then he will have to cut back again.
Thank you.
Mike Procard.
Chairman, can I also say it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship for the first time. My question it's related to the bill proposing implementing the Prisoner Earnings Act 1996. Yeah. So we're already on that subject, and we've heard evidence already this morning that there's a feeling that prisons aren't equipped to employ people meaningfully. Do you agree with that? And if so, what can be done to achieve it?
It depends what prison you're looking at. If you're looking at some of the local prisons that are severely overcrowded and that don't have the correct workspaces and workshops that prisoners can actually go to do the work. For example, Home House is a newish prison, but they've got over 1,000 prisoners, and only 100 of them were allocated to the workshop doing 34 hours of work. Now that's a tiny proportion in relation to Home House. There's other aspects of the prisoners working and the amount of money that we would have a problem with. I'm happy to elaborate on that later.
But the point that previous person in the evidence session was giving was that it needn't necessarily be the type of work that you're talking about, the workshops that are already there. If we're talking about external companies coming in and setting up a business within prison, then surely it would be up to them to set up the infrastructure to actually allow those prisoners to do the meaningful work. So is that not a better way forward?
Well, that would be very interesting. That would be a very interesting concept. But the reality is there's no meat on the bone at this moment in time, and we don't know what individuals, companies may well be talking about. And if I can just give you an example of, and by the way, we are broadly supportive of prisoners working, but it's got to be meaningful, and it's got to be constructive, and it's got to be worthwhile, not putting knives and forks in plastic envelopes for airlines. I don't think that assists at all. And of course, you've got to look at the situation with regards to companies that may well be laying people off on the outside and coming into prisons and setting up workforces. I'm not sure how the general public would actually view that.
Well, can I ask one further last question? Because you major on the word meaningful, that it has to be meaningful work, and then say that you used the example of putting the knives and forks together. There's plenty of people outside of prison that are doing that type of work and regard it as meaningful because of what it actually achieves for them. Surely that's what we're trying to get for the prisoners. This sense of meaningful work is actually in supporting their families and giving something back to society.
Well, I certainly wasn't being demeaning to anybody in outside industry. I thought what we were trying to do was to rehabilitate prisoners so that they didn't come back. And unfortunately, for the last 25 years or so, we've been playing political football with it, and we've not actually got anywhere. And to be honest with you, the real issues are alcohol abuse, drug abuse, mental health issues, education and social exclusion. And until there's investment made in those areas, then we're just going to go round in circles.
Andy Slaughter.
Insofar as there will be any new resources to deal with rehabilitation, and particularly if there are going to be enhanced community punishments, it will come through payment by result and through that route alone. Does that cause you any concerns, and how do you see that working?
It doesn't cause me concern at this moment in time, for the simple reason that we don't know enough about payment by results. The first pilot, obviously, was started at Peterborough, and yet we're awaiting the results of those pilots, which are not due out until 2015. So to lay all your eggs in one basket, as we've just seen in the market testing process of Doncaster, where it was said that the payment by results ethos there was in effect the reason it got them a contract, yet it's not been measured, and we seem to be playing a little bit of fast and loose and a little bit of Russian roulette in relation to the criminal justice system.
Jonathan Ledger.
Yeah, I mean, on that point, I agree completely with Steve. We know very little at the moment, and the signs are that the project in Peterborough will take some time to assess. It does seem to be something of a side issue, I have to say, in terms of those working on the ground, and in terms of those who are dealing with community supervision on every day-to-day basis. At the moment, that's had no impact at all. But we genuinely do have concerns that there are issues about how you measure payment by results and what it actually is you're looking to find out. Are you actually looking to improve recidivism rates and things like that, which we'd all support? The problem is with some sort of profit motive or a financial incentive around it, we would fear that the wrong motivation may begin to underpin a payment by results system. That's certainly something we'd expect to be rigorously scrutinised.
One more at the moment. I don't know if you had a chance to look at the Civitas report that came out this week. That seemed to say that rehabilitation as it's envisaged in the bill would not work for repeat offenders, and that not enough consideration would be given. And from your own experience, particularly Mr. Ledger, do you feel that's the case or not?
Can you say, I missed the beginning of what you said.
It doesn't matter whether you've seen it really, but the Civitas report, it's a report that came out this week commenting effectively on the rehabilitation as the government envisages it at the moment, and saying that, in part, that they were not persuaded that would work in the case of consistent repeat offenders. Do you think that more needs to be done to deal with specifically that problem?
Well, from a NAPO perspective, we have argued consistently, and in our response to the Green Paper, we argue very strongly for an increase in resources for the probation service in order to focus on offenders, particularly in the category you just described, so that we could actually target the sort of problem behaviour they were presenting and intervene intensively and actually frequently at an early stage post-sentence. So the concern is that something of the revolution has been lost in the resulting bill, I have to say, and we'd welcome much of the original Green Paper that had been presented to us. Something of that has been lost, and we fear that there's less now of a focus on how we intervene positively in order to essentially change lives, to use the old chestnut. But by doing that, that's how we protect communities and reduce the number of victims that our communities have. So there is a genuine fear now, yes, it would be true to say, that there's been a shift away from the focus on early intervention and rehabilitation, which may have unfortunate consequences.
Steve Gillen.
I have seen that report, and I do concur that we've had a big problem with prolific offenders and repeat offenders. Again, I refer to Home House and some of the excellent work that's going on there at the moment, where prisoners are actually identified as being prolific, and prison officers are actually attached to them now, and a multi-agency approach from outside in the community within it. We've done this sort of thing probably 20 years ago. It was called Through Care, but because of resources, again, it goes by the wayside, and it's very important that we get back to that ethos of investment, because if we invest in the right areas, the prison population will come down, and people, the general public, will get what they want anyway, an efficient prison system and criminal justice system.
Yes, I could ask about resources, but I think if my colleague's going to ask about that, I'll stop there.
There's a lot of your colleagues lined up to make a contribution, starting with Mr. Dave Watts.
we hear them from witnesses that they're very keen on the strategy and they believe that the resources should be transferred basically from the prison centres to the community programmes that are an alternative to a prison sentence. Given the fact that you just said that you seem to need more space, more resources, what will the impact be if what happens is we see cuts in the overall budget and then we see further cuts from your budgets to pay for improved services in the probation service and drink prevention and all the other things? What's the practical impact that would have on prisons?
Steve Gillan.
Very interesting analogy, and I don't have all the answers to that. However, what I do know was in 1993-94 there was approximately 43,000 prisoners, and now we've got 85,000 prisoners, and we have roughly the same amount of staff in prisons to work with those prisoners, so it's actually doubled, but the staff hasn't. I think we've got to get back to multi-agency networks working. There's got to be a balance between community-based stuff and prison, because the reality is the general public want to feel safe, and I think sometimes the general public get forgotten in all this.
Can I just add to that? I mean, I think the important point here is that we are complementary services, prison and probation, and we shouldn't be set up against each other in any way, certainly in the context of resources and their cuts. Key work that prison staff do, is absolutely essential to the good work the probation service does when we're dealing with those who have been released. So it's vital that you look at it in the round rather than seeing them in that sense as competing against each other.
Can I just ask then, is it your view that there isn't scope to transfer resources away from the prison service itself, that the resources that are there, if you want to do things like the work programme, if you want to do more work within the prisons, you would need to have that same resource? Because there seems to me, and I don't know about other members of the committee, some contradiction here where there seems to be the easy hit is first of all the Treasury take a lump sum out of the system, and then we transfer some into the preventive service and probation and youth offending, and that comes from your budget when you're saying there isn't that scope.
Yes, and it's constantly adjusting the balance and often coming up with the same result, unfortunately. But the resources are interlinked in that sense, and we have argued, as I say, from an NAPO perspective, that actually there should be less people going into prison for short sentences. We see little point in that, and I mean, Steve will give his own view on this from the POA perspective, but we also think it isn't always easy for prisons to intervene in a positive way and end up being warehouses, essentially, rather than positively intervening in the lives of those that they have custody of. But that argument is not about taking resources away, it's about freeing up resources in the prison system in order to be able to work effectively in the way Steve described in his earlier answers to you.
Steve Gillan.
Yes, I don't think it's right to rob Peter to pay Paul, because everybody clearly does a good job, whether it's probation services, social workers, prison officers. But certainly on behalf of my members, I'm clear in what my members believe, and that they're the forgotten service. Resources have been rushed away. There's this rush to privatisation and market testing to make it cheaper. We believe it will be more dangerous, because we don't believe the prison population will actually drop. In fact, it's increased slightly since last July.
Yvonne Favard.
I'd like to move on to the duty to explain sentences, really. I mean, do you feel that there are some offenders who don't understand the sentences, and what resources do you think you need to be able to explain that fully to them?
Sentencing has always been very, very confusing, and I've got to say I don't think the general public understands sentencing that well. I think some people coming in to, for example, my members have got to be trained in it, in what the sentencing policies are, what sentencing means. I think it's too complicated, and I think it needs sorted out rather quickly.
I think the probation service has a key role to play here. I mean, one of the points we've been concerned recently about what we see as a slight dumbing down in the quality of court reports that can be done for the courts these days. And when I was a practising probation officer, the pre-sentence report was absolutely key to sentences in terms of making their judgment. And one of the things you did through the process of preparing a report was actually explain sentences to those you were working with. So the offenders actually got the explanation from you, whether it was going to be a custodial sentence or some sort of community sentence. In some ways, again, don't want to harp on about resources, but the focus on speed and shortening processes actually is not helping us, because we can actually explain these things, we can go through and prepare people for whatever the outcome of the court appearance is going to be. So I think it's an interesting point that you've made, and again, we're very worried that we're not able to do as good a job as we used to be able to.
Thank you.
Alfred Freud.
Mr Gillen, you believe that the prison population is going to increase, and you therefore think this bill will not affect that increase. Is that right?
I actually think partially correct. I actually believe that you can't just look at the sentencing bill in isolation to everything else that's going on with the cuts generally. In relation to the way the police have been cut, the budgets have been cut there, probation, every area, even voluntary services, community services, inevitably, we believe, and there is slight evidence out there, that when unemployment goes up, then crime will go up. So we do not believe that the prison population will fall as dramatically as what is anticipated. And of course, with the U-turn in relation to the discount rate of 50%, there's now some black hole in that budget of £130 million. And we are greatly concerned with regards to that, about how that is going to be achieved.
Would you support the notion put by some authorities that it's time to have a full audit of everybody currently in prison, and look at those with mental health problems, look at those with drug problems and so on, who are not a danger to society, and consider whether they actually should be in prison?
Clearly, we believe that some people shouldn't be in prison. That there are the mentally ill, the self-harmers, that all goes into that envelope. And if there is engagement and there is a process further down the line that they can be diverted away, then we would fully support that, because then it would free up the prison population to a manageable degree where my members can get on with the proactive work that they're paid to do on behalf of society.
Jonathan,
I think in terms of Mr Clewe's question that's why, reflecting on what I said earlier, we're so disappointed in many ways in some of the shifts in the bill that has appeared from the Green Paper that originally prompted it. Certainly the elements that may be added that have been discussed, I know, by government, which introduce perhaps more mandatory imprisonment for certain types of behaviour and effectively reduce the discretion of the judiciary, I think are disappointing, and they run the risk of increasing the prison population considerably, and meaning that the prison staff have to deal with longer term prisoners, the disaffected prisoners who are being retained longer. It also has an impact on the work of the probation service, because judicial discretion is very much based on the advice and assessments that we provide. And again, where there is less discretion to be used, there is less opportunity to fully explore the reasons why offending behaviour has taken place, and identify in those reasons ways in which you can deal with it and address it in the hope of stopping it happening in the future.
Alex Cunningham.
Mr Gillen talked earlier of the need not to rob Peter to pay Paul, but what we actually have is both Peter and Paul being robbed in order to pay the Treasury. Your organisation has campaigned very, very hard against cuts in prison, probation, the youth offending service and others. So is it actually realistic for the government to have this aspiration for greater community sentences when there is such a cuts environment?
In relation to that, there's a couple of ways I can answer that. We want to see the prison population fall, but we want to see it fall so that communities are safer and that reoffending decreases. I don't see how that can be married up with the budget cuts that are going over the next 4 or 5 years in relation to that in every area and every walk of life. I just don't see how that will actually happen, and I think, as we have said continually, that the criminal justice system will eventually go into meltdown.
So what about the victims then? I mean, there's issues about what does this actually mean for victims of crime and our communities?
Well, I think the probation service is often attacked for not focusing enough on victims, and we've always argued with that, because actually that focus has been strong for a good part of 20 years now in the probation service. It's a significant shift. Yes, you're absolutely right. The dangers of what you're talking about and the cuts and our ability to work in the community in the context of probation staff means that we are less able to protect those communities potentially if there are less qualified, able staff who know their communities and know the type of offending behaviour they're presented with, to intervene. A lot of this work is unseen. Much of the work of the probation service is only seen when something goes wrong.
So this bill, with its cuts and everything else, are actually putting our communities and our victims at further risk.
Well, there's no getting away that cuts are bad news for any service that's being provided. And if I've talked for probation, there's no doubt about the fact that it relates to, if you believe in the probation service, as I do, you know that it has an impact on criminal behaviour. If the probation service is not so able to do its job and is affected by having less staff, less resources to do so, then that must have some identified impacts on criminal behaviour.
Ben Wallace, then Helen Goodman and Andy Slaughter.
Perhaps one of the ways you could free up some money is that there are 3,400 prisoners serving sentences who've served their tariff but are on IPP. That's roughly about £120 million a year we spend on their custody. Would you agree that getting to grips with that backlog and perhaps finding them an appropriate setting, whether that's out, under the guises of the probation service, would be a good way of perhaps finding alternative funding?
I'm happy to answer that. I mean, certainly the IPP system needs to be sorted out so as that people are getting on the right courses and aren't just lost in the system. And we would welcome any suggestions coming forward through this bill that would adequately address that, but at the same time protect the general public from violent crime.
Again, I would support that. The difficulty we have is that high-risk offenders attract a huge amount of media attention, and if we are going to work constructively in the community with them, we need to make sure, we come back to the resource point, but we need to make sure that everything is in place in terms of staffing and support to make sure that we can do that job properly, to maintain the confidence of the public, but also to ensure that we're intervening in a positive way. But people simply left without these situations being addressed is not good, because they themselves lose an understanding of why they are still in prison, essentially, and so the impact of the sentence is then undermined as well.
Helen Goodman.
Steve mentioned earlier the importance of multi-agency working, and in fact it was a point also made by Juliet Lyon in the previous evidence session. Do you think that we should have a stronger duty to cooperate, both between the prison service and the probation service, but also with other services in the community, local authorities, housing associations, maybe health authorities, so that people don't fall through the cracks?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is essential, because if you don't have that, and I call it old school, I call it through care, so that we do track the offender right through to where they're going, because there's nothing worse, and we've seen it time and time again, when an offender is released out into the community, back into the same environment that they came from in the first place, only to come back 6 weeks later. I don't think that helps the taxpayer. I don't think it actually helps prisons, and it certainly, we've seen it for the last 25 years. We've had situations where young mothers have gone out with their babies from prison with nowhere to go. Now, to me, that just can't be a society that we want to accept.
I just want to add to that the partnership commitment, again, it's very strong in the probation service, and it's been developed over years across probation services in England and Wales. And to deal with the sort of issues that Steve raises, my anxiety at the moment in the current climate is that a lot of those partnership agencies, voluntary charitable organisations, are at risk and under threat and are struggling to maintain the sort of service they provide, and that will certainly be a huge loss to the probation service in its work. Clearly we can't do everything, and we need to be able to refer to specialist services and support agencies in order to do the work that we do in the communities.
Andy Slaughter.
Taking the bill as a whole, it seems there are quite a lot of new responsibilities being put on prison officers and probation, and quite complex changes to sentencing, which you will have to understand and explain. But the cuts, and you may want to correct us on this, we've been told 10,000 prison officers over time going up to 10% cuts in probation services by region this year. Have you had experience of that level of cuts before? And what difference do you think that is going to make to the service you're able to provide?
No, we've not experienced those level of cuts before. This is something new, completely new to us, and there's a lot of fear amongst my members because they want to do a decent job on behalf of the general public. and I fear they're not going to be able to do that. And it was only last year...
Order. I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr Gillen, but under the terms of the programme motion, I have to bring this particular session to an end, and I'd like to thank both yourself and Mr Ledger for your time this morning and giving evidence to the committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you.